Chapter 3, Part 1 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, War of England and France in Alliance against the United Provinces, 1672 to 1674. Finally, of France against combined Europe, 1674 to 1678, sea battles of Solebay, the Texel, and Stromboli. Part 1. Shortly before the conclusion of the Peace of Breda, Louis XIV made his first step towards seizing parts of the Spanish Netherlands and Franche-Comté. At the same time that his armies moved forward, he sent out a state paper setting forth his claims upon the territories in question. This paper showed unmistakably the ambitious character of the young king, roused the anxiety of Europe, and doubtless increased the strength of the peace party in England. Under the leadership of Holland, but with the hearty co-operation of the English minister, an alliance was formed between the two countries and Sweden, hitherto the friend of France, to check Louis's advance before his power became too great. The attack, first on the Netherlands in 1667 and then on Franche-Comté in 1668, showed the hopeless weakness of Spain to defend her possessions. They fell almost without a blow. The policy of the United Provinces relative to the claims of Louis at this time was summed up in the phrase that France was good as a friend, but not as a neighbor. They were unwilling to break their traditional alliance, but still more unwilling to have her on their border. The policy of the English people, though not of their king, turned toward the Dutch. In the increased greatness of Louis they saw danger to all Europe, to themselves more especially, if, by a settled preponderance on the continent, his hands were free to develop his sea power. Flanders, once in the power of Louis XIV, wrote the English ambassador Temple, "The Dutch feel that their country will be only a maritime province of France," and sharing that opinion, he advocated the policy of resistance to the latter country, whose domination in the Low Countries he considered as a threatened subjection of all Europe. He never ceased to represent to his government how dangerous to England would be the conquest of the sea provinces by France, and he urgently pointed out the need of a prompt understanding with the Dutch. "This would be the best revenge," said he, "for the trick France has played us in involving us in the last war with the United Provinces." These considerations brought the two countries together in that triple alliance with Sweden, which has been mentioned, and which for a time checked the onward movement of Louis. But the wars between the two sea nations were too recent, the humiliation of England in the Thames too bitter, and the rivalries that still existed too real, too deeply seated in the nature of things, to make that alliance durable. It needed the dangerous power of Louis and his persistence in a course threatening to both to weld the union of these natural antagonists. This was not to be done without another bloody encounter. Louis was deeply angered at the Triple Alliance, and his wrath was turned mainly upon Holland, in which, from the necessities of her position, he recognized his most steadfast opponent. For the time, however, he seemed to yield, the more readily because of the probable approaching failure of the Spanish royal line, and the ambition he had of getting more than merely the territory lying to the east of France, when the throne became vacant. But though he dissembled and yielded, from that time he set his mind upon the destruction of the Republic. This policy was directly contrary to that laid down by Richelieu, and to the true welfare of France. It was to England's interest, at least just then, that the United Provinces should not be trodden down by France, but it was much more to the interest of France that they should not be subjected to England. England, free from the continent, might stand alone upon the seas, contending with France; but France, hampered by her continental politics, could not hope to wrest the control of the seas from England without an ally. This ally Louis proposed to destroy, and he asked England to help him. The final result is already known, but the outlines of the contest must now be followed. Before the royal purpose had passed into action, and while there was still time to turn the energies of France into another channel, a different course was proposed to the king. This was the project of Leibnitz, before spoken of, which has special interest for our subject, because, in proposing to reverse the lines which Louis then laid down, to make continental expansion secondary and growth beyond the sea the primary object of France, the tendency avowedly and necessarily was to base the greatness of the country upon the control of the sea and of commerce. The immediate object offered to the France of that day, with the attainment of which, however, she could not have stopped short, was the conquest of Egypt. That country which, facing both the Mediterranean and Eastern seas, gave control of the great commercial route which in our own day has been completed by the Suez Canal. That route had lost much of its value by the discovery of the way round the Cape of Good Hope, and yet more by the unsettled and piratical conditions of the seas through which it lay. But with a really strong naval power occupying the key of the position, it might have been largely restored. Such a power, posted in Egypt, would, in the already decaying condition of the Ottoman Empire, have controlled the trade not only of India and the Far East, but also of the Levant. But the enterprise could not have stopped there. The necessity of mastering the Mediterranean and opening the Red Sea, closed to Christian vessels by Mohammedan bigotry, would have compelled the occupation of stations on either side of Egypt, and France would have been led step by step, as England has been led by the possession of India, to the seizure of points like Malta, Cyprus, Aden, in short, to a great sea power. That is clear now, but it will be interesting to hear the arguments by which Leibnitz sought to convince the French king 200 years ago. After pointing out the weakness of the Turkish Empire and the readiness with which it might be further embarrassed by stirring up Austria and Poland, the latter, the traditional ally of France, after showing that France had no armed enemy in the Mediterranean, and that on the other side of Egypt she would meet the Portuguese colonies, longing to obtain protection against the Dutch in India, the memorial proceeds. The conquest of Egypt, that Holland of the East, is infinitely easier than that of the United Provinces. France needs peace in the West, war at a distance. War with Holland will probably ruin the new Indian companies as well as the colonies and commerce lately revived by France, and will increase the burdens of the people while diminishing their resources. The Dutch will retire into their maritime towns, stand there on the defensive in perfect safety, and assume the offensive on the sea with great chance of success. If France does not obtain a complete victory over them, she loses all her influence in Europe, and by victory she endangers that influence. In Egypt, on the contrary, a repulse, almost impossible, will be of no great consequence, and victory will give the dominion of the seas, the commerce of the East and of India, the preponderance in Christendom, and even the empire of the East on the ruins of the Ottoman power. The possession of Egypt opens the way to conquests worthy of Alexander. The extreme weakness of the Orientals is no longer a secret. Whoever has Egypt will have all the coasts and islands of the Indian Ocean. It is in Egypt that Holland will be conquered. It is there she will be despoiled of what alone renders her prosperous, the treasures of the East. She will be struck without being able to ward off the blow. Should she wish to oppose the designs of France upon Egypt, she would be overwhelmed with the universal hatred of Christians. Attacked at home, on the contrary, not only could she ward off the aggression, but she could avenge herself, sustained by universal public opinion, which suspects the views of France of ambition. The memorial had no effect. All that the efforts of ambition and human prudence could do to lay the foundations for the destruction of a nation, Louis XIV now did. Diplomatic strategy on a vast scale was displayed in order to isolate and hem in Holland. Louis, who had been unable to make Europe accept the conquest of Belgium by France, now hoped to induce it to see without trembling the fall of Holland. His efforts were in the main successful. The Triple Alliance was broken. The King of England, though contrary to the wishes of his people, made an offensive alliance with Louis, and Holland, when the war began, found herself without an ally in Europe, except the worn-out kingdom of Spain and the Elector of Brandenburg, then by no means a first-class state. But in order to obtain the help of Charles II, Louis not only engaged to pay him large sums of money, but also to give to England, from the spoils of Holland and Belgium, Walcheren, Sluys, and Cadsand, and even the islands of Goree and Vuren. The control, that is, of the mouths of the great commercial rivers, the Scheldt and the Meuse. With regard to the united fleets of the two nations, it was agreed that the officer bearing the admiral's flag of England should command in chief. The question of naval precedence was reserved by not sending the admiral of France afloat, but it was practically yielded. It is evident that in his eagerness for the ruin of Holland and his own continental aggrandizement, Louis was playing directly into England's hand as to power on the sea. A French historian is justified in saying, "These negotiations have been wrongly judged. It has been often repeated that Charles sold England to Louis XIV. This is true only of internal policy. Charles, indeed, plotted the political and religious subjugation of England with the help of a foreign power, but as to external interests, he did not sell them, for the greater share in the profit from the ruin of the Dutch was to go to England." During the years preceding the war, the Dutch made every diplomatic effort to avert it, but the hatred of Charles and Louis prevented any concession being accepted as final. An English royal yacht was ordered to pass through the Dutch ships of war in the Channel, and to fire on them if they did not strike their flags. In January 1672, England sent an ultimatum, summoning Holland to acknowledge the right of the English crown to the sovereignty of the British seas, and to order its fleets to lower their flags to the smallest English man of war; and demands such as these received the support of a French king. The Dutch continued to yield, but seeing at length that all concessions were useless, they in February ordered into commission 75 ships of the line, besides smaller vessels. On the 23rd of March, the English, without declaration of war, attacked a fleet of Dutch merchantmen, and on the 29th the king declared war. This was followed, April 6th, by the declaration of Louis XIV, and on the 28th of the same month he set out to take command in person of his army. The war which now began, including the third and last of the great contests between the English and Dutch upon the ocean, was not, like those before it, purely a sea war, and it will be necessary to mention its leading outlines on the land also, not only in order to clearness of impression, but also to bring out the desperate straits to which the Republic was reduced, and the final deliverance through its sea power in the hands of the great seaman De Ruyter. The naval war differs from those that preceded it in more than one respect, but its most distinctive feature is that the Dutch, except on one occasion at the very beginning, did not send out their fleet to meet the enemy, but made what may properly be called a strategic use of their dangerous coast and shoals, upon which were based their sea operations. To this course they were forced by the desperate odds under which they were fighting; but they did not use their shoals as a mere shelter. The warfare they waged was the defensive offensive. When the wind was fair for the allies to attack, Ruyter kept under cover of his islands, or at least on ground where the enemy dared not follow. But when the wind served so that he might attack in his own way, he turned and fell upon them. There are also apparent indications of tactical combinations on his part of a higher order than have yet been met, though it is possible that the particular acts referred to, consisting in partial attacks amounting to little more than demonstrations against the French contingent, may have sprung from political motives. This solution for the undoubted fact that the Dutch attacked the French lightly has not been met with elsewhere by the writer, but it seems possible that the rulers of the United Provinces may have wished not to increase the exasperation of their most dangerous enemy by humiliating his fleet, and so making it less easy to his pride to accept their offers. There is, however, an equally satisfactory military explanation in the supposition that the French, being yet inexperienced, Ruyter thought it only necessary to contain them while falling in force upon the English. The latter fought throughout with their old gallantry, but less than their old discipline, whereas the attacks of the Dutch were made with a sustained and unanimous vigor that showed a great military advance. The action of the French was at times suspicious. It has been alleged that Louis ordered his admiral to economize his fleet, and there is good reason to believe that toward the end of the 2 years that England remained in his alliance, he did do so. The authorities of the United Provinces, knowing that the French fleet at Brest was to join the English in the Thames, made great exertions to fit out their squadron so as to attack the latter before the junction was made. But the wretched lack of centralization in their naval administration caused this project to fail. The province of Zealand was so backward that its contingent, a large fraction of the whole, was not ready in time, and it has been charged that the delay was due not merely to mismanagement, but to disaffection to the party in control of the government. A blow at the English fleet in its own waters by a superior force before its ally arrived was a correct military conception. Judging from the after history of this war, it might well have produced a profound effect upon the whole course of the struggle. Ruyter finally got to sea and fell in with the allied fleets, but, though fully intending to fight, fell back before them to his own coast. The allies did not follow him there, but retired, apparently in full security, to Southwold Bay, on the east coast of England, some 90 miles north of the mouth of the Thames. There they anchored in 3 divisions, 2 English, the rear and centre of the allied line, to the northward, and the van, composed of French ships, to the southward. Ruyter followed them, and on the early morning of June 7, 1672, the Dutch fleet was signaled by a French lookout frigate in the northward and eastward, standing down before a northeast wind for the allied fleet, from which a large number of boats and men were ashore in watering parties. The Dutch order of battle was in 2 lines, the advanced one containing 18 ships with fire ships. Their total force was 91 ships of the line, that of the allies 101. The wind was blowing toward the coast, which here trends nearly north and south, and the allies were in an awkward position. They had first to get under way, and they could not fall back to gain time or room to establish their order. Most of the ships cut their cables, and the English made sail on the starboard tack, heading about north-northwest, a course which forced them soon to go about, whereas the French took the other tack. The battle began, therefore, by the separation of the allied fleet. Ruyter sent 1 division to attack the French, or rather to contain them, for these opponents exchanged only a distant cannonade, although the Dutch, being to windward, had the choice of closer action if they wished it. As their commander, Bankert, was not censured, it may be supposed he acted under orders; and he was certainly in command a year later, and acting with great judgment and gallantry at the battle of the Texel. Meanwhile Ruyter fell furiously upon the two English divisions, and apparently with superior forces; for the English naval historians claim that the Dutch were in the proportion of 3-2. If this can be accepted, it gives a marked evidence of Ruyter's high qualities as a general officer, in advance of any other who appears in this century. The results of the battle, considered simply as an engagement, were decisive. Both sides lost heavily, but the honors and the substantial advantages all belonged to the Dutch, or rather to De Ruyter. He had outgeneraled the allies by his apparent retreat, and then, returning, had surprised them wholly unprepared. The false move by which the English, two-thirds of the whole, stood to the northward and westward, while the other third, the French, went off to the east and south, separated the allied fleet. Ruyter threw his whole force into the gap, showing front to the French with a division probably smaller in numbers, but which from its position to windward had the choice of coming to close action or not, while with the remainder he fell in much superior strength upon the English. Paul Hoste says that Vice Admiral d'Estrées, commanding the French, had taken measures for tacking and breaking through the Dutch division opposed to him, so as to rejoin the Duke of York, the allied commander in chief. It may be so, for d'Estrées was a very brave man, and not enough of a seaman to appreciate the dangers of the attempt; but no such move was begun, and both the English and Ruyter thought that the French rather avoided than sought close action. Had d'Estrées, however, gone about and attempted to break through the line of experienced Dutchmen to windward of him with the still raw seamen of France, the result would have been as disastrous as that which overtook the Spanish admiral at the battle of St. Vincent 125 years later, when he tried to reunite his broken fleet by breaking through the close order of Jervis and Nelson. The truth, which gradually dawns through a mass of conflicting statements, is that the Duke of York, though a fair seaman and a brave man, was not an able one; that his fleet was not in good order, and was thus surprised; that his orders beforehand were not so precise as to make the French admiral technically disobedient in taking the opposite tack from the commander in chief, and so separating the squadrons; and that Ruyter profited most ably by the surprise which he had himself prepared, and by the further opportunity given him by the ineptness of his enemies. Unless for circumstances that are not stated, the French admiral took the right tack with a northeast wind, for it led out to sea and would give room for manoeuvring. Had the Duke of York chosen the same, the allied fleet would have gone out together, with only the disadvantage of the wind and bad order. In that case, however, Ruyter could and probably would have done just what he did at the Texel a year later, check the van, the French, with a small containing force, and fall with the mass of his fleet upon the centre and rear. It is the similarity of his action in both cases, under very different conditions, that proves he intended at Southwold Bay merely to keep the French in check, while he destroyed the English. In this battle, called indifferently Southwold Bay and Solebay, Ruyter showed a degree of skill combined with vigor which did not appear upon the sea after his death until the days of Suffren and Nelson. His battles of the War of 1672 were no affairs of circumspection, though they were fought circumspectly. His aim was no less than the enemy's total overthrow, by joining good combinations to fury of attack. At Solebay he was somewhat, though not greatly, inferior to his enemies; afterward much more so. The substantial results of Solebay fight were wholly favorable to the Dutch. The allied fleets were to have assisted the operations of the French army by making a descent upon the coast of Zealand. Ruyter's attack had inflicted an amount of damage and caused an expenditure of ammunition which postponed the sailing of the fleet for a month. It was a diversion not only important but vital in the nearly desperate condition to which the United Provinces were reduced ashore. It may be added as an instructive comment on the theory of commerce destroying that after this staggering check to the enemy's superior forces, Ruyter met and convoyed safely to port a fleet of Dutch merchantmen. The progress of the land campaign must now be briefly described. Early in May, the French army in several corps moved forward, passing through the outskirts of the Spanish Netherlands and directing their attack upon Holland from the south and east. The Republican party, which was in power in Holland, had neglected the army, and now made the mistake of scattering the force they had among many fortified towns, trusting that each would do something toward delaying the French. Louis, however, under the advice of Turenne, simply observed the more important places, while the second-rate towns surrendered nearly as fast as they were summoned. The army of the provinces, as well as their territory, thus passing rapidly by fractions into the power of the enemy. Within a month the French were in the heart of the country, having carried all before them, and with no organized force remaining in their front sufficient of itself to stop them. In the fortnight following the battle of Solebay, terror and disorganization spread throughout the Republic. On the 15th of June, the Grand Pensionary obtained permission of the States General to send a deputation to Louis XIV, begging him to name the terms on which he would grant them peace. Any humiliation to the foreigner was better in the eyes of the politician than to see the opposite party, the House of Orange, come into power on his downfall. While negotiations were pending, the Dutch towns continued to surrender, and on the 20th of June a few French soldiers entered Muiden, the key to Amsterdam. They were only stragglers, though the large body to which they belonged was near at hand, and the burghers, who had admitted them under the influence of the panic prevailing throughout the land, seeing that they were alone, soon made them drunk and put them out. The nobler feeling that animated Amsterdam now made itself felt in Muiden. A body of troops hurried up from the capital, and the smaller city was saved. Situated on the Zuyder Zee, 2 hours distant from Amsterdam, at the junction of a number of rivers and canals, Muiden not only held the key of the principal dikes by which Amsterdam could surround herself with a protecting inundation, it also held the key of the harbor of this great city, all the ships which went from the North Sea to Amsterdam by the Zuyder Zee being obliged to pass under its guns. Muiden saved and its dikes open, Amsterdam had time to breathe and remained free to break off her communications by land and to maintain them by sea. It was the turning point of the invasion. But what would have been the effect upon the spirit of the Dutch, oppressed by defeat and distracted in council, if in that fateful fortnight which went before the allied fleet had attacked their coasts? From this they were saved by the battle of Solebay. Negotiations continued. The burgomasters, the party representing wealth and commerce, favored submission. They shrank from the destruction of their property and trade. New advances were made, but while the envoys were still in the camp of Louis, the populace and the Orange party rose, and with them the spirit of resistance. On the 25th of June, Amsterdam opened the dikes, and her example was followed by the other cities of Holland. Immense loss was entailed, but the flooded country and the cities contained therein, standing like islands amid the waters, were safe from attack by land forces until freezing weather. The revolution continued. William of Orange, afterward William III. Of England, was on the 8th of July made Stadtholder and head of the army and navy, and the two De Witts, the heads of the Republican party, were murdered by a mob a few weeks later. The resistance, born of popular enthusiasm and pride of country, was strengthened by the excessive demands of Louis XIV. It was plain that the provinces must conquer or be destroyed. Meanwhile, the other states of Europe were waking up to the danger, and the Emperor of Germany, the Elector of Brandenburg, and the King of Spain declared for Holland, while Sweden, though nominally in alliance with France, was unwilling to see the destruction of the provinces, because that would be to the advantage of England's sea power. Nevertheless, the next year, 1673, opened with promise for France, and the English king was prepared to fulfill his part of the compact on the seas. But the Dutch, under the firm leadership of William of Orange, and with their hold on the sea unshaken, now refused to accept conditions of peace which had been offered by themselves the year before. 3 naval battles were fought in 1673, all near the coast of the United Provinces. The first two, June 7 and June 14, off Schoneveldt, from which place they have taken their name. The third, known as the Battle of the Texel, August 21. In all three, Ruyter attacked, choosing his own time, and retiring when it suited him to the protection of his own shores. For the allies to carry out their objects and make any diversion upon the seaboard, or on the other hand to cripple the sea resources of the hard-pressed provinces, it was necessary first to deal successfully with Ruyter's fleet. The great admiral and his government both felt this, and took the resolution that the fleet should be posted in the passage of Schoneveldt, or a little farther south toward Ostend, to observe the enemy, and if attacked, or seeing the enemy's fleet disposed to make a descent upon the shores of the United Provinces, should resist vigorously by opposing his designs and destroying his ships. From this position, with good lookouts, any movement of the allies would be known. The English and French put to sea about the 1st of June, under the command of Prince Rupert, first cousin to the king, the Duke of York, having been obliged to resign his office on account of the passage of the Test Act, directed against persons of the Roman Catholic faith holding any public employment. The French were under Vice Admiral d'Estrées, the same who had commanded them at Solebay. A force of 6,000 English troops at Yarmouth was ready to embark if de Ruyter was worsted. On the 7th of June the Dutch were made out, riding within the sands at Schoneveldt. A detached squadron was sent to draw them out, but Ruyter needed no invitation. The wind served, and he followed the detached squadron with such impetuosity as to attack before the allied line was fairly formed. On this occasion the French occupied the centre. The affair was indecisive, if a battle can be called so in which an inferior force attacks a superior, inflicts an equal loss, and frustrates the main object of the enemy. A week later Ruyter again attacked, with results which, though indecisive as before as to the particular action, forced the allied fleet to return to the English coast to refit and for supplies. The Dutch in these encounters had 55 ships of the line, their enemies 81, 54 of which were English. The allied fleets did not go to sea again until the latter part of July, and this time they carried with them a body of troops meant for a landing. On the 20th of August the Dutch fleet was seen under way between the Texel and the Meuse. Rupert at once got ready to fight, but as the wind was from the northward and westward, giving the allies the weather gauge, and with it the choice of the method of attack, Ruyter availed himself of his local knowledge, keeping so close to the beach that the enemy dared not approach. The more so as it was late in the day. During the night the wind shifted to east-southeast off the land, and at daybreak, to use the words of a French official narrative, the Dutch made all sail and stood down boldly into action. The allied fleet was to leeward, and the port tack heading about south. The French in the van, Rupert in the centre, and Sir Edward Spragge commanding the rear. De Ruyter divided his fleet into 3 squadrons, the leading one of which, of 10 or 12 ships only, he sent against the French. while with the rest of his force he attacked the English in the centre and rear. If we accept the English estimate of the forces, which gives the English 60 ships, the French 30, and the Dutch 70, Ruyter's plan of attack, by simply holding the French in check, as at Solebay, allowed him to engage the English on equal terms. The battle took on several distinct phases, which it is instructive to follow. M. de Martel, commanding the van of the French, and consequently the leading subdivision of the allied fleet, was ordered to stretch ahead, go about, and gain to windward of the Dutch van, so as to place it between two fires. This he did, but as soon as Bankert, the same who had manoeuvred so judiciously at Solebay the year before, saw the danger, he put his helm up and ran through the remaining 20 ships of D'Estrées' squadron with his own 12, a feat as creditable to him as it was discreditable to the French, and then wearing round stood down to De Ruyter, who was hotly engaged with Rupert. He was not followed by D'Estrées, who suffered him to carry this important reinforcement to the Dutch main attack undisturbed. This practically ended the French share in the fight. Rupert, during his action with De Ruyter, kept off continually with the object of drawing the Dutch farther away from their coast, so that if the wind shifted they might not be able to regain its shelter. De Ruyter followed him, and the consequent separation of the centre from the van was one of the reasons alleged by D'Estrées for his delay. It does not, however, seem to have prevented Bankert from joining his chief. In the rear, an extraordinary action on the part of Sir Edward Spragge increased the confusion in the allied fleet. For some reason this officer considered Tromp, who commanded the Dutch rear, as his personal antagonist, and in order to facilitate the latter's getting into action, he hove to, stopped the whole English rear to wait for him. This ill-timed point of honor on Spragge's part seems to have sprung from a promise he had made to the king that he would bring back Tromp alive or dead, or else lose his own life. The stoppage, which recalls the irresponsible and insubordinate action of the junior Dutch flag officers in the former war, of course separated the rear, which also drifted rapidly to leeward, Spragge and Tromp carrying on a hot private action on their own account. These two junior admirals sought each other personally, and the battle between their flags was so severe that Spragge twice had to shift his own to another ship. On the second occasion the boat in which he was embarked was sunk by a shot, and he himself drowned. Rupert, thus forsaken by his van and rear, found himself alone with Ruyter, who, reinforced by his van, had the address further to cut off the rear subdivision of the allied centre, and to surround the remaining 20 ships with probably 30 or 40 of his own. It is not creditable to the gunnery of the day that more substantial results did not follow; but it is to be remembered that all Ruyter's skill could secure, except for probably a very short time, was an action on equal terms with the English. His total inferiority in numbers could not be quite overcome. The damage to the English and Dutch may therefore have been great, and was probably nearly equal. Rupert finally disengaged himself, and seeing that the English rear was not replying well to its immediate opponents, ran down toward it, Ruyter following him, the two opposing centres steering parallel courses and within cannon shot, but by mutual consent, induced perhaps by ammunition running short, refraining from firing. At 4 P.M. the centres and rears united, and toward 5 a fresh engagement began, which continued till 7, when Ruyter withdrew, probably because of the approach of the French, who by their own accounts rejoined Rupert about that time. This ended the battle, which, like all that preceded it in this war, may be called a drawn fight, but as to which the verdict of the English naval historian is doubtless correct. The consequences which the Dutch, through the prudence of their admiral, drew from this battle were exceedingly great, for they opened their ports, which were entirely blocked up, and put an end to all thoughts by removing the possibility of an invasion. The military features of the action have sufficiently appeared in the account that has been given. The skill of De Ruyter, the firmness and promptness of Bankert, first in checking and then in passing through the French division, the apparent disloyalty, or at the best inefficiency of the latter, the insubordination and military blundering of Spragge, the seeming lack of everything but hard fighting on Rupert's part. The allies indulged in bitter mutual recriminations. Rupert blamed both D'Estrées and Spragge. D'Estrées found fault with Rupert for running to leeward, and D'Estrées' own second, Martel, roundly called his chief a coward in a letter which earned him an imprisonment in the Bastille. The French king ordered an inquiry by the intendant of the navy at Brest, who made a report, upon which the account here given has mainly rested, and which leaves little doubt of the dishonor of the French arms in this battle. M. D'Estrées gave it to be understood, says the French naval historian, that the king wished his fleet spared, and that the English should not be trusted. Was he wrong in not relying upon the sincerity of the English alliance, when he was receiving from all quarters warnings that the people and the nobles were murmuring against it, and Charles II. Was perhaps alone in his kingdom in wishing it? Possibly not. But he was surely wrong if he wished any military man or body of men to play the equivocal part assigned to the French admiral on this day. The loss of the fleet would have been a lighter disaster. So evident to eye-witnesses was the bad faith or cowardice, and the latter supposition is not admissible, that one of the Dutch seamen, as they discussed among themselves why the French did not come down, said, "You fools, they have hired the English to fight for them, and all their business here is to see that they earn their wages." A more sober-minded and significant utterance is that with which the intendant at Brest ends the official report before mentioned. It would appear in all these sea fights Ruyter has never cared to attack the French squadron, and that in this last action he had detached 10 ships of the Zealand squadron to keep it in play. No stronger testimony is needed to Ruyter's opinion of the inefficiency or faithlessness of that contingent to the allied forces. End of Chapter 3, Part 1.